Imagine a world without numbers, a world where the sun rises and sets, the seasons turn, and the river floods, but no one truly knows how many people stood on its banks, how many mouths needed feeding, how many hands could build, how many bodies could fight. A world of vast, unknowable populations. Now, imagine the first flicker of an idea, the subtle shift in thought from the infinite to the finite. The moment a mind dared to ask not many, but how many? This seemingly simple question, whispered across the dawn of civilization, was not a trivial inquiry. It was the birth of an empire. It was the first act of true, organized power. Welcome to Sleepless Historian, a journey into the meticulously boring, yet utterly fascinating history of the census. A tale not of kings or battles, but of lists, ledgers, and the quiet, relentless human drive to count itself, to quantify its existence, to tame the wild chaos of population into neat, ordered columns. For millennia, the census has been the silent backbone of civilization, the invisible framework upon which empires were built, sustained, and occasionally toppled. It is the story of how rulers, from the earliest city-states to the most advanced modern nations, transformed the swirling mass of humanity into data, and in doing so, they transformed the very nature of governance, taxation, and war. So, dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let us drift into the hypnotic drone of historical enumeration. Let the quiet rhythm of ancient record-keeping lull you into understanding the profound power of a simple count. Chapter 1. Scene 1. The prenumeric void, survival, and the absence of data. Before the concept of counting populations, human groups operated on instinct and immediate observation. In the earliest hunter-gatherer societies, the scale of community was inherently limited. A tribe rarely exceeded 150 individuals, a number known in anthropology as Dunbar's number, the cognitive limit to the number of people with whom one can maintain stable social relationships. For these groups, a formal census was unnecessary. The elder knew every face, every name, every strength, and every weakness. The count was inherent in the daily interaction, woven into the very fabric of their social existence. The necessities of survival dictated their attention, the movement of game, the ripening of berries, the changing of the seasons. There was no surplus to manage, no grand construction projects requiring extensive labor allocation, and certainly no taxation in any modern sense. Resources were immediate, consumed, or moved with. The concept of people was not an abstract numerical entity, it was a collection of known individuals, each distinct, each vital. The idea of a numerical total, of a collective figure that encompassed all these individual lives, simply didn't exist in a functional administrative capacity. The administrative unit was the individual, not the aggregated sum. The first stirrings of counting would have been practical, not governmental. Counting fingers and toes, a rudimentary tally of successful hunts, or the cycles of moon. These were analog counts, deeply tied to physical reality. The abstract notion of 100 detached from 100 specific objects was a profound cognitive leap, one that took millennia to solidify. The transition from specific, concrete counting, e.g., 3 deer, to abstract, generalized counting 300 people required a revolution in both thought and societal structure. This revolution was driven by a single powerful force, the advent of agriculture. Scene 1.2, the agricultural imperative, surplus, settlement, and the need for order. The Neolithic Revolution, the shift from foraging to farming, fundamentally altered human society and, in turn, birthed the necessity of the census. When humans began to settle, to cultivate land, and to produce a reliable food surplus, entirely new logistical challenges emerged. A settled village, then a town, then a city meant a fixed population. This population now needed to be sustained year-round from the harvest of a specific plot of land. The question immediately arose: how much grain do we need to store to feed how many people until the next harvest? This wasn't a question the elder could answer intuitively for 1,000 or 10,000 souls. This required numbers. The surplus itself created new forms of wealth and, inevitably, new forms of power. Those who controlled the surplus controlled the population. To effectively control, one needed to know the scale of what was being managed. How many laborers were available to work the fields, dig irrigation canals, or build defensive walls? How many young men were capable of bearing arms to protect the growing settlement and its valuable stores? The individual became a unit within a larger equation. This also meant the emergence of specialized roles beyond farming: potters, weavers, builders, and, crucially, administrators. These were the first proto-bureaucrats tasked with managing the increasingly complex web of resources and labor. Their primary tool, their ultimate weapon of organizational power, was the list, the tally, the inventory, the proto-census. The very act of settlement introduced an administrative problem that only enumeration could solve. The chaotic, flowing life of the hunter-gatherer was slowly being replaced by the ordered, quantified existence of the agrarian state. Scene 1.3. Mesopotamia, clay tablets, counting stones, and the dawn of record-keeping. Script. It is in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, around 3500 to 3000 BCE, that we find the earliest concrete evidence of systematic record-keeping that directly relates to population management. The Sumerians and later the Babylonians and Assyrians didn't conduct a census in a modern sense, a periodic nationwide count of every individual. Their approach was more granular, driven by the immediate administrative needs of their sprawling temple states and early empires. Their technology was simple yet revolutionary: clay. The rivers Tigris and Euphrates provided an endless supply of fine, plastic clay. Scribes wielding reed styluses would impress wedge-shaped marks, cuneiform, into these damp tablets. The information recorded was incredibly diverse: grain inventories, livestock totals, labor assignments, and lists of taxable households. While not a universal headcount, these records provided an unprecedented level of demographic data. Consider the counting stones or tokens that preceded cuneiform. These small clay shapes, cones, spheres, cylinders, represented quantities of specific goods. A sphere for a bushel of grain, a cone for an animal. These tokens were often placed inside hollow clay envelopes, known as bulli, which were then sealed. The outside of the bulli would be marked with the impression of the tokens within, essentially creating a bill of lading or an early contract. This system was designed for accountability, for knowing precisely how much was expected or delivered. When these systems were applied to human labor and tribute, they became a form of human enumeration. For example, temple administrators would keep detailed records of families assigned to work on public projects or lands. These were not anonymous numbers, they were specific households, often named by the head of the family with notes on their dependents and their labor output. These records allowed rulers to assess tribute, conscript labor for massive public works like ziggurats or irrigation systems, and estimate the available manpower for nascent military campaigns. The act of writing, the act of tallying, was inherently linked to the state's burgeoning power over its subjects. The individual became a line item, contributing to the state's material and military might. The quiet click of a stylus on wet clay was the sound of empire being tabulated. Scene 1.4. Early Egyptian registers, the Nile, the granary, and the Pharaoh's Reach. Further to the west, along the life-giving artery of the Nile, the ancient Egyptians also developed sophisticated systems of population management, arguably even more centralized than their Mesopotamian counterparts due to the unique geography of their kingdom. The annual inundation of the Nile, while vital for agriculture, also created a cyclical challenge: how much arable land would be available, and how many people were needed to work it after the waters receded. The pharaoh's administration maintained extensive registers for taxation and labor conscription. These were primarily focused on the allocation of land and the extraction of resources. Scribes with their reed pens and papyrus scrolls meticulously recorded property ownership, harvest yields, and the number of adult males available for various tasks. These tasks included not only farming the pharaoh's lands, but also colossal construction projects, from pyramids and temples to the intricate canal systems that crisscrossed the Fertile Delta. Evidence from ancient texts and archaeological finds, such as the papyri of Abusir from the 5th Dynasty, shows detailed records of temple personnel, their duties, and their rations. These weren't just counts of individuals, they were counts of functional units within the state apparatus. A man was not merely a man, he was a cultivator, a scribe, a builder, or a soldier, each designation carrying specific obligations and entitlements. This level of granular data allowed the pharaoh to project his power and manage resources across thousands of miles of riverine kingdom. The most famous early Egyptian census, though not a comprehensive count of every individual, was likely associated with the cattle count or taxation census. Every 2 years, the pharaoh would order a count of cattle, which served as a proxy for wealth and agricultural capacity. This wasn't just about animals, it was about the families who owned them, the land they grazed, and the grain they consumed. By counting the cattle, the pharaoh indirectly quantified the prosperity and tax base of his subjects. This biennial rhythm of counting instilled a sense of state omnipresence. The pharaoh's eye through his scribes was always watching, always counting, always assessing. The very act of surviving in Egypt meant being a part of the pharaoh's grand, tabulated plan. Scene 1.5. The philosophical underpinnings. Why count at all? So, why did these early civilizations embark on such painstaking, often unpopular efforts to count their people? It wasn't merely idle curiosity. The motivations were deeply pragmatic, driven by the harsh realities of early statecraft. Firstly, taxation. Empires are expensive. They require armies, civil servants, and monumental architecture. All of this is funded by taxes, whether in kind grain, livestock, or in labor. A census, however rudimentary, allowed rulers to estimate their potential revenue and ensure a degree of fairness, or at least consistency, in their demands. Without a count, taxation was arbitrary, leading to resentment and rebellion. With a count, however brutal, it became systematized. Secondly, conscription. Warfare was endemic in the ancient world. To raise an army, a ruler needed to know the pool of available fighting men. Lists of able-bodied males were invaluable for military planning, troop levies, and logistical support. The census was a prerequisite for military might. Thirdly, resource allocation. From managing public granaries to planning irrigation projects, knowing the population density and distribution was critical. A successful harvest meant knowing how many mouths needed feeding and where. A planned city meant knowing how many hands could build. Fourthly, legitimacy and control. The very act of enumerating a population asserted the ruler's authority. It made the invisible visible, transforming individuals into subjects within a defined, quantifiable territory. It was a declaration, these people are mine, and I know how many of them there are. The act of being counted, however intrusive, also offered a degree of recognition, a formal acknowledgement of one's existence within the state. Finally, public works and infrastructure. Building roads, temples, city walls. These required immense labor. A census provided the data for mobilizing that labor effectively, ensuring that projects could be completed on time and with the necessary manpower. The census was not just about knowing how many, it was about knowing who and where and for what purpose. It was the invisible hand that drew the blueprints of empire, a quiet testament to the enduring human desire to organize, control, and understand the vast shifting sands of its own kind. This chapter will be a massive exploration of the most iconic office in the history of counting, the Roman censor. We will explore the mechanics of the Villa Publica, the heavy weight of the Nota Censoria, and the ritual purification of the city. Chapter 2. The Roman Censor, the master enumerators of the Western world. Section 1. The Office of the Censor, the gravity of the list. In the Roman Republic, the census was not a chore for low-level clerks. It was a high-stakes ritual performed by the most senior statesmen in the land. The censor was a position of immense, almost terrifying power. Elected Every 5 years for an 18-month term, the two censors held the regimen morum, the right to regulate the public and private morals of every Roman citizen. Why link counting to morality? Because to the Romans, a citizen was not just a number, he was a functional unit of the state. The census, conducted on the Campus Martius at the Villa Publica, was the moment where your entire life was laid bare. You did not just report your name, you reported your property, your age, your children, and your slaves. Most importantly, you reported how you had lived. If a censor found your behavior unworthy, if you had been cowardly in battle, cruel to your family, or wasteful with your wealth, he could strike your name from the citizen rolls. He could move you to a lower social class. He could bankrupt you with a single stroke of his stylus. This was the nota censoria, a mark of public shame that could destroy a family's reputation for generations. To be counted by Rome was to be judged by Rome. Section 2. The tabulae censorii, the physics of the record. The technology of the Roman census was the wax tablet and the bronze tablet. For temporary records, the tabulae were used. These were wooden frames filled with a thin layer of blackened beeswax. The scribe would use a stylus made of bone or iron. The sharp end wrote, the flat, spatulated end erased. But once the data was finalized, it was transferred to the tabularium, the official archives on the Capitoline Hill. Here, the records were often engraved into bronze or written on volumina papyrus scrolls. Let us consider the sheer weight of this data. Every 5 years, hundreds of thousands of heads of household had to be registered. Each entry included 1. Nomen, the full name and lineage. 2. Census, the valuation of all property, including land, ager romanus, houses, livestock, and slaves. 3. Militia, the eligibility for military service based on age and health. The Romans organized this data into centuries. If you were wealthy, you were placed in the first class, capable of affording the full panoply of a heavy infantryman. If you were poor, you were the proletarii, those whose only contribution to the state was their proles offspring. The census was the bridge between the wealth of the individual and the might of the legion. It was a massive physical database that determined who fought, who voted, and who paid. Section 3. The lustrum, the chemistry of purification. The census was not complete until the city was purified. This was the lustrum. The Romans believed that the act of counting, of turning living people into static numbers, was a spiritually dangerous process. It was a fixing of the soul that required a massive sacrifice to the god Mars. The three animals, the bull, the ram, and the boar, were led in a circle around the gathered assembly of the Roman people. This circle was a magical boundary. It separated the pure, counted citizens from the chaotic, uncounted world outside. When the animals were sacrificed, the censor would offer a prayer for the continued prosperity of the Republic. Consider the word lustration. In chemistry, it refers to the purification of a substance. In Roman history, it was the reset button. The lustrum wiped away the spiritual grime of the previous 5 years. The new census rolls were sealed, and the Republic began again, freshly quantified and divinely sanctioned. The census was the rhythm of the Roman heart. It was the heartbeat of a civilization that refused to exist in the dark. Section 4. The Census of Augustus, enumerating an empire. When the Republic collapsed and Augustus became the first emperor, the census transformed from a city ritual into a global engine of bureaucracy. Augustus realized that he could not rule the world if he did not know what was in it. In the year 28 BCE, Augustus conducted the first empire-wide census in decades. He recorded 4,063,000 Roman citizens. By 14 CE, that number had grown to 4,937,000. But these were just the citizens. In the provinces Egypt, Judea, Syria, the census was carried out to calculate the tributum capitis, a poll tax, and the tributum soli, a land tax. This is the census that appears in the Gospel of Luke. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was not a friendly visit. To the provincials, the census was the sign of the oak. It meant Roman officials coming to your farm, counting your trees, weighing your grain, and demanding a share of your labor. The census was the invisible net that Augustus threw over the world to pull its wealth back to Rome. It was the moment the local world was conquered by the global spreadsheet. Section 5, the sociology of the Roman count. What did it feel like to be counted? For a Roman citizen, it was an affirmation of status. It was the moment you proved you were a part of the populus Romanus. It gave you the right to vote in the comitia centuriata. It was your identity card in a world of 50 million people. But for the uncounted, the slaves, the foreigners, the women, who were often registered only as property of their fathers or husbands, the census was a wall. It was a reminder of their exclusion. The Roman census was a binary system. You were either on the list or you were a non-person in the eyes of the law. The census also managed the manumission of slaves. If a master allowed his slave to be entered into the census rolls by the censor, that slave was instantly and legally free. The stylus was a magic wand. It could turn property into a person with a single entry. We are looking at the ultimate power of data, the power to define who exists, who matters, and who is free. Chapter 3. The Silk and the Scroll, the Han Dynasty and the Huji System. Section 1. The Mandate of the Number. In the year 2 CE, the Han Dynasty performed a feat that defies the imagination of the ancient world. They conducted a nationwide census and recorded a population of 57,671,400 individuals living in 12,233,062 households. This was not a rough estimate. This was the Huji, the household registration system. To the Han emperors, the census was the mandate of heaven made manifest. If the population was growing and the granaries were full, the emperor held the divine right to rule. If the numbers dwindled, the emperor was failing. Unlike Rome, where the census was a ritual of social rank, in China, the census was an engine of harmony. It was the way the center breathed with the periphery. The emperor was the head, and the census was the nervous system that told him exactly how much strength was in the limbs of his empire. Section 2. Bamboo and silk, the hardware of the Han clerk. How do you count 57 million people without paper? You use the bamboo slip jian. The technology of the Han census was a triumph of organic engineering. Young bamboo was harvested, split into thin slats, and dried over a fire to remove the sap and prevent rot. These slats were then tied together with hemp or silk cords to create a folding mat. Let us consider the physics of the scroll. A single household's data was written vertically from top to bottom. The ink was made from pine soot and glue, creating a permanent, waterproof carbon bond with the wood. These slips were incredibly durable. While Roman wax could melt and papyrus could crumble, the Han bamboo archive survived for centuries in the damp soil of the Yellow River Valley. When the central government demanded a count, thousands of local magistrates across 1,500 counties would unroll these bamboo mats, update the ink, and send the data up the administrative ladder. It was a decentralized database that aggregated into a central imperial master file. Section 3. The Huji, the total encompassing of the individual. The Han census was totalitarian in the original sense of the word. It sought to encompass the total life of the subject. The Huji registration was mandatory. Every household had to post a wooden tablet outside their door, listing every inhabitant. Section 2. The tabulae censorii, the physics of the record. The technology of the Roman census was the wax tablet and the bronze tablet. For temporary records, the tabulae were used. These were wooden frames filled with a thin layer of blackened beeswax. The scribe would use a stylus made of bone or iron. The sharp end wrote, the flat, spatulated end erased. But once the data was finalized, it was transferred to the tabularium, the official archives on the Capitoline Hill. Here, the records were often engraved into bronze or written on volumina papyrus scrolls. Let us consider the sheer weight of this data. Every 5 years, hundreds of thousands of heads of household had to be registered. Each entry included one nomen, the full name and lineage. 2. Census, the valuation of all property, including land, ager romanus, houses, livestock, and slaves. 3. Militia, the eligibility for military service based on age and health. The Romans organized this data into centuries. If you were wealthy, you were placed in the first class, capable of affording the full panoply of a heavy infantryman. If you were poor, you were the proletarii, those whose only contribution to the state was their proles offspring. The census was the bridge between the wealth of the individual and the might of the legion. It was a massive physical database that determined who fought, who voted, and who paid. Section 3. The lustrum, the chemistry of purification. The census was not complete until the city was purified. This was the lustrum. The Romans believed that the act of counting, of turning living people into static numbers, was a spiritually dangerous process. It was a fixing of the soul that required a massive sacrifice to the god Mars. The three animals, the bull, the ram, and the boar, were led in a circle around the gathered assembly of the Roman people. This circle was a magical boundary. It separated the pure, counted citizens from the chaotic, uncounted world outside. When the animals were sacrificed, the censor would offer a prayer for the continued prosperity of the republic. Consider the word lustration. In chemistry, it refers to the purification of a substance. In Roman history, it was the reset button. The lustrum wiped away the spiritual grime of the previous 5 years. The new census rolls were sealed, and the republic began again, freshly quantified and divinely sanctioned. The census was the rhythm of the Roman heart. It was the heartbeat of a civilization that refused to exist in the dark. Section 4. The census of Augustus, enumerating an empire. When the republic collapsed and Augustus became the first emperor, the census transformed from a city ritual into a global engine of bureaucracy. Augustus realized that he could not rule the world if he did not know what was in it. In the year 28 BCE, Augustus conducted the first empire-wide census in decades. He recorded 4,063,000 Roman citizens. By 14 CE, that number had grown to 4,937,000. But these were just the citizens. In the provinces Egypt, Judea, Syria, the census was carried out to calculate the tributum capitis, a poll tax, and the tributum soli, a land tax. This is the census that appears in the Gospel of Luke. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was not a friendly visit. To the provincials, the census was the sign of the oak. It meant Roman officials coming to your farm, counting your trees, weighing your grain, and demanding a share of your labor. The census was the invisible net that Augustus threw over the world to pull its wealth back to Rome. It was the moment the local world was conquered by the global spreadsheet. Section 5. The sociology of the Roman count. What did it feel like to be counted? For a Roman citizen, it was an affirmation of status. It was the moment you proved you were a part of the populus Romanus. It gave you the right to vote in the comitia centuriata. It was your identity card in a world of 50 million people. But for the uncounted, the slaves, the foreigners, the women, who were often registered only as property of their fathers or husbands, the census was a wall. It was a reminder of their exclusion. The Roman census was a binary system. You were either on the list or you were a non-person in the eyes of the law. The census also managed the manumission of slaves. If a master allowed his slave to be entered into the census rolls by the censor, that slave was instantly and legally free. The stylus was a magic wand. It could turn property into a person with a single entry. We are looking at the ultimate power of data, the power to define who exists, who matters, and who is free. Chapter 3. The Silk and the Scroll, the Han Dynasty and the Huji System. Section 1. The Mandate of the Number. In the year 2 CE, the Han Dynasty performed a feat that defies the imagination of the ancient world. They conducted a nationwide census and recorded a population of 57,671,400 individuals living in 12,233,062 households. This was not a rough estimate. This was the huji, the household registration system. To the Han emperors, the census was the mandate of heaven made manifest. If the population was growing and the granaries were full, the emperor held the divine right to rule. If the numbers dwindled, the emperor was failing. Unlike Rome, where the census was a ritual of social rank, in China, the census was an engine of harmony. It was the way the center breathed with the periphery. The emperor was the head, and the census was the nervous system that told him exactly how much strength was in the limbs of his empire. Section 2. Bamboo and silk, the hardware of the Han clerk. How do you count 57 million people without paper? You use the bamboo slip jian. The technology of the Han census was a triumph of organic engineering. Young bamboo was harvested, split into thin slats, and dried over a fire to remove the sap and prevent rot. These slats were then tied together with hemp or silk cords to create a folding mat. Let us consider the physics of the scroll. A single household's data was written vertically from top to bottom. The ink was made from pine soot and glue, creating a permanent, waterproof carbon bond with the wood. These slips were incredibly durable. While Roman wax could melt and papyrus could crumble, the Han bamboo archive survived for centuries in the damp soil of the Yellow River Valley. When the central government demanded a count, thousands of local magistrates across 1,500 counties would unroll these bamboo mats, update the ink, and send the data up the administrative ladder. It was a decentralized database that aggregated into a central imperial master file. Section 3. The huji, the total encompassing of the individual. The Han census was totalitarian in the original sense of the word. It sought to encompass the total life of the subject. The huji registration was mandatory. Every household had to post a wooden tablet outside their door, listing every inhabitant. The data collected was exhaustive. 1. Name and gender, the basic unit. 2. Age. Crucial for determining the zwa, the labor tax. At age 15, a male entered the taxable bracket. At age 56, he was retired from physical labor duties. 3. Occupation. Were you a farmer, an artisan, or a merchant? Merchants were often taxed at double the rate to discourage unproductive labor. 4. Property, specifically the amount of land and the number of taxable trees. The census was used to implement the equal field system. If the census showed a region was overpopulated, the emperor would forcibly migrate thousands of families to the frontier, giving them virgin land to farm. The census was a tool for social engineering. It allowed the state to move human beings across the map like pieces on a board, ensuring that no land was wasted and no person was idle. Section 4. The brush and the inkstone, the art of the clerk. The hero of the Han census was the shur, the scholar official. To be a census taker in China, you had to be a master of calligraphy. The beauty of the character was a reflection of the accuracy of the data. Consider the molecular action of the brush. A brush made of wolf hair or rabbit fur could hold a specific volume of ink. The flow of the ink onto the bamboo required a steady hand and a calm mind. This created a standardized bureaucracy. Whether you were in the tropical south or the frozen north, the forms were the same, the characters were the same, and the expectations were the same. This linguistic unity was the operating system of the census. It meant that a clerk in the capital could read a report from 1,000 miles away and understand it perfectly. The census didn't just count people, it enforced a universal culture. Section 5. The Yellow Registers and the Philosophy of the People. The Han eventually transitioned some records to silk and early paper, often dyed yellow to protect against insects. These became the Yellow Registers. The philosophy behind these registers was deeply Confucian. The people, men, were seen as the root of the state. To count them was to tend the garden. If the root was neglected, the tree of the empire would fall. This created a unique feedback loop. Unlike Rome, where the census was often about extraction, the Han census was also about protection. In times of famine, the census data told the emperor exactly which districts needed grain from the imperial storehouses. The number was a contract. The people gave the state their labor and their data, and in return, the state gave them order, irrigation, and survival. The Han Census was the first time in history that a state attempted to know its people not just as subjects to be taxed, but as a biological organism to be managed. It was the birth of biopolitics. Chapter 4. The Conqueror's Ledger, the Domesday Book and the Medieval Inquest. Section 1. The Verdict of the Earth. In the year 1086, 20 years after the Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror sat in his midwinter court and realized he did not truly own England. He owned the land, but he did not own the knowledge of the land. He commissioned the Great Survey to the Anglo-Saxons who lived there. This was not a census. It was an intrusion into the soul of their property. They called it the Domesday Book. Why? Because like the Day of Judgment, its word was final. You could not appeal it. You could not argue with it. Once the scribe's ink dried on the sheepskin, that was your reality. If the book said you had 20 cows, you paid taxes on 20 cows, even if 10 had died in the winter. The Domesday Book was the first time a European king attempted to create a total inventory of a nation's physical existence. It was the moment the wild Middle Ages were tamed by the grid. Section 2. Vellum and gall, the chemistry of the record. The technology of Domesday was biological. It was written on vellum, fine parchment made from the skin of calves. Let us consider the materials science of the medieval record. To create the Domesday Book, hundreds of sheep and calves were slaughtered. The skins were soaked in lime to remove hair, stretched on wooden frames, and scraped with a lunellum, a crescent-shaped knife, until they were thin enough to be translucent. The ink was iron gall ink. It was made by mixing crushed oak galls, deformities caused by wasps, with iron sulfate. This ink is unique because it doesn't just sit on the paper, it is acidic. It bites into the collagen fibers of the vellum. This is why the Domesday Book still exists today, nearly 1,000 years later. It is not just a book, it is a chemical bond between the king's intent and the animal's skin. The census was written in a medium designed to outlive the people it counted. It was a permanent memory for a kingdom of frail men. Section 3. The Inquest, the Human Algorithm. How did William gather the data? He invented the inquest. He sent circuits of commissioners into every county. They didn't just ask the lord of the manor, they used a cross-verification algorithm. In every village, they gathered a jury. They asked the same set of questions. 1. Who held the land in the time of King Edward before the conquest? 2. Who holds it now? 3. How many hides, units of land, are there? 4. How many plow teams, units of labor? 5. How many villagers, cotters, and slaves? 6. How much meadow, pasture, and woodland? 7. What was the total value then, and what is it now? The commissioners compared the answers of the locals against the records of the tax collectors. If the numbers didn't match, someone was punished. This was crowdsourced intelligence backed by the threat of the sword. The census wasn't just a count, it was an audit of the conquest. It was William's way of ensuring that no Norman baron was hiding wealth from the crown. The census was the eye of the king looking into every barn and every hovel in the land. Section 4. The Calculus of the Hide. The unit of the Domesday Census was the hide. But a hide was not a fixed measurement of area like an acre. It was a unit of productivity. A hide was defined as the amount of land sufficient to support a family for a year. In fertile Kent, a hide might be small. In the rocky north, a hide might be vast. The census was calculating economic potential, not geography. This is the birth of fiscal mapping. The king wasn't interested in the size of the field. He was interested in the caloric output of the field. He was counting plow power. An 8-ox team was the engine of the 11th century. By counting the oxen, the king was counting his GNP, gross national product. The Domesday Book turned the mud and sweat of England into a mathematical abstraction that could be managed from a stone castle in London. Section 5. The Empty Space, the Silence of the Count. The most chilling part of the Domesday Census is what it doesn't count. In the records for Northern England, Page after page is marked with a single word: wasta, waste. This was the result of the harrying of the North, where William's army systematically destroyed crops and livestock to crush a rebellion. The census here becomes a record of destruction. When the census taker finds nothing to count, it is a mathematical proof of a genocide. The Domesday Book is a balance sheet of power. It shows a kingdom in transition, from the loose, tribal structures of the Saxons to the rigid, feudal, and quantified structures of the Normans. It was the last time a European king would attempt such a feat for centuries. After 1086, the census went underground, becoming a matter of local parish records, until the Enlightenment arrived to bring the light of statistics back to the world. Chapter 5: The Statistical Revolution, Bills of Mortality, and the Democratic Count. Section 1: The Anatomy of the Dead, the Bills of Mortality. Before we learn to count the living for their potential, we learn to count the dead for our protection. In the 1600s, London was a city under siege by an invisible enemy, the plague. To understand the enemy, the city created the Bills of Mortality. Every week, searchers would visit every parish to identify the cause of death. These numbers were aggregated and printed. A man named John Grunt looked at these lists and did something revolutionary. He looked for patterns. He realized that if you knew how many people died of the flux or the king's evil at a certain age, you could calculate the probability of life. This was the birth of actuarial science. Grunt realized that a population was not just a chaotic mass, it was a statistical body with predictable laws. The census shifted from a snapshot of wealth to a movie of mortality. We began to count not just attacks, but to predict. The number became a shield against the mystery of death. Section 2: The 1790 American Experiment, the Power of the Seat. In 1790, the newly formed United States did something no nation had ever done. It made the census a constitutional requirement. Article 1, Section 2 mandated a count every 10 years. Why? Not for taxes, but for power. The American census was the first democratic count. The number of representatives each state sent to Congress was determined by its population. This turned the census into a political battlefield. If you weren't counted, your state lost its voice. Let us consider the logistics of the wilderness. The first census was carried out by 650 U.S. Marshals. They had no forms. They had no maps. They rode on horseback into the frontier, carrying sheets of parchment they had ruled by hand. They counted 3.9 million people. But there was a dark mathematical compromise, the 3/5 clause. For the purpose of representation, enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person. This was the moment statistics became a weapon of systemic oppression. The census was no longer just about how many, but who counts as a whole. Section 3: The Malthusian Ghost, the Fear of the Infinite. As the 1800s dawned, a new fear took hold: the fear of overpopulation. Thomas Malthus published his essay on the principle of population, arguing that humans multiply geometrically $2 for $16, while food only increases arithmetically $1 to $3 for dollars. This Malthusian trap turned the census into an emergency alarm. Governments in Europe realized that if they didn't know their growth rate, they would face total societal collapse and starvation. In 1801, Great Britain conducted its first modern census. The census takers were no longer just looking at hides or land. They were looking at density. They began to ask about occupation and condition of the dwelling. The census became a tool for public health. By mapping the numbers, we could see where the cholera was striking. We could see where the poverty was concentrated. The census became the doctor of the state, using numbers to diagnose the sickness of the industrial city. Section 4: The Hollerith Revolution, the Physics of the Punch. By 1880, the U.S. Census was in crisis. It took 7 years to count the data by hand. By the time they finished, the data was already obsolete. They needed a mechanical mind. Enter Herman Hollerith. He invented the punch card tabulator. He realized that a person's life could be encoded into a piece of cardstock. A hole in column 3, row, meant male, A hole in column 5 meant farmer. Consider the electrical logic. When the card was placed in the machine, a series of pins would drop. If there was a hole, the pin touched a pool of mercury, completing a circuit and advancing a dial. This was the ancestor of the computer. The 1890 census, which should have taken a decade, was finished in 6 weeks. The human number had become a machine pulse. We had successfully digitized humanity. The census was no longer a book, it was a current. Section 5, the sociology of the average man. The rise of the modern census created a new character in the human story, the average man l'homme moyen. Adolphe Quetelet, a Belgian statistician, argued that by averaging the census data, you could find the ideal citizen. This was a profound psychological shift. For the first time, individuals began to compare themselves to the national mean. Am I taller than average? Do I earn more than average? Do I have fewer children than average? The census didn't just count us, it standardized us. It created a norm that everyone felt pressured to follow. The state used these averages to design schools, hospitals, and prisons. We became statistical subjects. The census was the mirror that the nation held up to its own face, but it was a mirror that only showed the aggregate truth, never the individual's soul. We have reached the final threshold. In this closing act, we transition from the physical ledger to the invisible grid. We are moving into a world where the census is no longer an event, but a constant, ambient state of being. Chapter 6, the digital ghost, satellites, algorithms, and the post-census world. Section 1, the death of the knock on the door. For 5,000 years, the census required a physical encounter. A scribe, a priest, a marshal, or a clerk had to look you in the eye and record your existence. But in the 21st century, the knock on the door is becoming a relic of the past. We are entering the era of the administrative census. Governments in nations like Denmark and Sweden no longer send out forms. They don't need to. Your account is already live. Between your tax records, your health insurance, your property deed, and your digital footprint, the state possesses a real-time ghost of your identity. The census has shifted from a periodic snapshot to a continuous stream. We are no longer counted. We are tracked into existence. Section 2, the eye in the sky, remote sensing. How do you count a population in a war zone or a remote rainforest? You use the physics of light. Modern demographers now use nighttime lights, NTL data. By measuring the intensity of photons emitted by a region at night, algorithms can estimate population density with staggering accuracy. They combine this with satellite imagery analysis, using AI to count rooftops and calculate the square footage of informal settlements. Consider the formula of presence. By analyzing the digital breadcrumbs left by mobile phone pings against cell towers, researchers can map the diurnal pulse of a city where people sleep versus where they work. The census is no longer a list of names, it is a map of energy. We have turned the human population into a thermal signature, a flickering light, on a global motherboard. Section 3, the algorithmic shadow, privacy versus precision. As our counting becomes more precise, it becomes more dangerous. The census used to be a statistical shield. Your data was aggregated so your individual life remained private. But in the age of big data, we face the re-identification crisis. Using differential privacy algorithms, census bureaus now have to inject mathematical noise into their data to prevent hackers from reverse engineering a table to find out exactly what you earn or who you live with. The census is now a war between the need to know and the right to be hidden. We are at a crossroads where the very numbers meant to empower us as citizens could be used to profile us as targets. Section 4, the eternal tally. We have traveled from the riverbanks of Mesopotamia to the vacuum of space. We have seen the census used as a tool for taxes, a weapon for war, a map for health, and a scale for democracy. At its core, the census is our collective attempt to say, we are here, we matter, we are a part of the whole. It is the ultimate human ledger. As you drift into sleep, remember that you are a part of a lineage of billions who have been counted, recorded, and remembered. The list continues. The numbers turn. The count never truly ends. Chapter 8. The Quipu. Counting by the knot in the Incan Empire. Section 1. The Textile Database. High in the Andes Mountains, the Inca Empire managed a population of 12 million people across some of the most rugged terrain on Earth. And they did it without a single drop of ink or a single sheet of paper. Their census was recorded on the Quipu. A Quipu was a string logic computer. It consisted of a primary chord with subordinate chords of different colors, textures, and lengths. Each color represented a category: red for war, yellow for corn, white for peace. The census was recorded in the knots. A long knot represented a number from 2 to 9, while a single knot represented 10, 100, or 1,000. Consider the tactile memory of the Quipucamayak, the keeper of the knots. To read the census, he didn't use his eyes, he used his fingers. He would run his hands down the strings, feeling the topography of the population. The Incan census was a 3D spreadsheet. It was a physical manifestation of the empire's people, woven into a fabric that could be folded up and carried across a mountain range in a single hand. Section 2. The vertical census. The Incan census had to account for altitude. Because their empire stretched from the sea to the peaks, the count was organized vertically. The Quipucamayak recorded who lived in the Yunga, the lowlands, the Quechua, the valleys, and the Puna, the high plateaus. This was microclimatic management. The census told the Sapa Inca, the emperor, exactly how much llama wool was being produced in the cold heights and how much coca leaf was being harvested in the warm valleys. It was a census of ecology. By counting the people according to their altitude, the Inca created a vertical economy where resources were traded up and down the mountain like a giant stone staircase. The knots in the string were the heartbeat of the Andes. Chapter 9. The Industrial Ledger. Counting the cogs of the factory. Section 1. The Time Clock Census. As the 19th century arrived, the census moved indoors. It entered the factory. The Industrial Revolution required a new kind of counting, the shift count. For the first time, human life was counted not by the year or the household, but by the minute. The clocking-in machine was a localized daily census. It transformed the human being into labor hours. Factory inspectors began to conduct social surveys. They counted the number of children under the age of 10 working in the textile mills. They counted the number of cubic feet of air per worker to determine if a factory was a death trap. The census became a tool for labor reform. We began to count the cost of progress. The numbers on the ledger started to reflect the soot in the lungs and the hours of the day. We were no longer just citizens or subjects. We were units of productivity. Chapter 10. The Parish Ghost. How the Church Counted Souls. Section 1. The Bell and the Pen. Long before the modern nation-state had the power to knock on every door, the church was already there. For centuries in Europe, the only census that existed was the sound of the parish bell. Every time a child was born, the bell rang for a baptism. Every time a couple wed, the bell rang for a marriage. And every time a soul departed, the passing bell told the village that the count had decreased by 1. The local priest was the original data entry officer. To him, the population was not a tax base, it was a flock of souls. In 1538, Thomas Cromwell, the minister to Henry VIII, issued an injunction that every parish in England must keep a sure coffer with a book to record these events. This was the birth of the parish register. It was a decentralized biological database. If you weren't in the priest's book, you didn't legally exist. You couldn't inherit land, you couldn't prove your age, and you couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. The church book was the bridge between the earthly count and the heavenly one. Section 2. The Logic of the Soul Gate. The parish register was a gatekeeper. It tracked the 3 great transitions of the human experience: hatch, match, and dispatch. Let us consider the micro-history of the entry. Unlike the Roman census, which happened every 5 years, the parish register was event-driven data. It was updated in real time. Because of this, these books are now the most valuable tools for modern genealogists. They contain the ghosts of people who left no other trace on history, the laborers, the servants, the unimportant people who never owned enough land to be in a king's ledger. But there was a statistical bias in the church's count. It only counted the Orthodox. If you were a dissenter, a Jew, or a heathen, you were invisible to the parish book. You were a statistical outcast. The church's census was a tool of exclusion. To be counted was to be in the fold. To be uncounted was to be lost in the wilderness of history. The ink in the register was the blood of identity. Section 3. The tithe, the economics of the altar. While the priest cared for the soul, the church also cared for the tenth. This was the tithe. The tithe census was perhaps the most intrusive count in medieval life. Every year, the church was entitled to 10% of everything the land produced. This required a constant, seasonal inventory. The priest didn't just count people, he counted sheaves of wheat, litters of piglets, and buckets of milk. Pause. In some villages, they used tithe maps, extraordinarily detailed drawings that showed every single strip of land and who farmed it. This was the pre-modern spreadsheet. It created a tension between the village and the altar. The farmers would try to hide their best produce, the church would try to find it. This daily, grinding process of checking the tenth meant that the church knew the capacity of the land better than the king ever did. The census was a ritual of sacrifice and extraction, woven into the very fabric of the harvest. Chapter 11, the colonial grid, counting the other. Section 1, the cartography of control. When European empires expanded into Africa, Asia, and the Americas, they brought the census with them as a weapon of classification. In the colonies, the census was not about representation. It was about categorization. The British Raj in India, for example, conducted massive censuses that attempted to pigeonhole hundreds of millions of people into rigid castes and tribes. The census takers were obsessed with scientific taxonomy. They created lists of criminal tribes and martial races. By counting people this way, the empire actually created new social realities. People who had lived with fluid identities for centuries were suddenly told they belonged to a specific, numbered category on a government form. The census was a social mold that hardened the structures of society to make them easier to rule. It was the paper partition of the human soul. Section 2. The counting of the invisible. The most horrific census in human history was the manifest of the slave ship. On these ships, human beings were stripped of their names and turned into cargo numbers. They were measured in tons of displacement and heads of livestock. This was the ultimate dehumanized census. The data didn't record age or dreams or lineages, it recorded capacity and mortality rates. When these individuals reached the plantations of the Caribbean or the Americas, they were entered into plantation ledgers. They were counted alongside the sugar mills and the mules. This inventory of flesh is a dark reminder of what happens when the power of the census is detached from the dignity of the human person. It is a count that exists only for depreciation and profit. To look at these ledgers today is to see the statistical ghost of a crime that no number can ever fully quantify. We have spent thousands of years counting ourselves. Now we turn our statistical eye outward to the very fabric of reality. We are moving from the census of man to the census of everything. Chapter 12, the census of the stars, mapping the infinite. Section 1, the celestial ledger, from Gaia to the great beyond. For 5 millennia, we have been obsessed with counting every head on Earth. But in the 21st century, the census has left the atmosphere. We are currently engaged in the most ambitious inventory ever attempted, the Gaia mission. Launched by the European Space Agency, the Gaia satellite is a celestial census taker. Its goal is to create a 3D map of over 1 billion stars in our galaxy. It measures their positions, their distances, and their motions with a precision equivalent to measuring the diameter of a human hair from 1,000 kilometers away. Why count the stars? Because just like the Roman censor, we seek to understand the state of the realm. By counting the stars, we learn the history of our galaxy, its births, its collisions, and its eventual fate. The population of the Milky Way is no longer a mystery, it is a database. We have taken the same logic used to count sheep in Sumer and applied it to the burning furnaces of the cosmos. We are no longer just counting our neighbors, we are counting our origins. Section 2. The quantum census, counting the invisible. If we can count the largest things in existence, we must also count the smallest. Welcome to the census of the atom. In the world of quantum mechanics, counting becomes a paradox. According to the Pauli exclusion principle, no two fermions, like electrons, can occupy the same quantum state at the same time. This is the universal census law. It ensures that matter has volume and structure. Without this rule of the count, everything in the universe would collapse into a single point. Today, we use quantum sensors to count individual photons of light and single atoms of matter. We are performing a census of the void, measuring the zero-point energy of empty space. This is the ultimate inventory. We are counting the building blocks of reality to see if the accounts of physics actually balance. The census has moved from the village square to the Large Hadron Collider, where we count the debris of smashed atoms to find the God particle. The number is no longer a social tool, it is the code of creation. Section 3. The Library of Life, the Genomic Count. There is one final census happening right now inside you. It is the Human Genome Project and its successors. In the 1990s, we began a census of the 3.2 billion base pairs that make up the Human Instruction Manual. We weren't counting people, we were counting the letters of life. Today, we perform a microbiome census, counting the trillions of bacteria that live in your gut. We have realized that a human being is not a single number. You are a walking ecosystem. A census of a single person reveals a population of trillions of organisms. This is the infinite recursion of the count. The more we look, the more we find. The census has become a fractal. Every time we think we have finished the tally, we discover a new layer of existence that needs to be numbered. Section 4. The pulse of the number. We have reached the end of our journey through the history of the count. We have seen that the census is more than just a list of names. It is the way humanity tries to make sense of the chaos. Whether it is a priest in a candlelit vestry or a supercomputer in a cooled server room, the impulse is the same: to be seen, to be known, to be counted. As the lights dim and the world grows quiet, imagine the sheer scale of the numbers we have discussed. Trillions of lives, billions of stars, and an infinite number of atoms, all held together by the simple act of counting. You are one of those numbers. You are a data point in the grandest story ever told. And in the eyes of history, every single one of us counts. Chapter 13. The Emperor's Grid, Napoleon and the Metricization of Man. Section 1. The Death of the Local Measure. Before Napoleon Bonaparte, Europe was a mathematical chaos. Every village had its own definition of a foot, its own weight for a bushel, and its own way of counting its people. You could walk 10 miles and enter a completely different numerical universe. Napoleon realized that you cannot run a modern empire on local truths. He brought the metric system and the standardized census to every territory he conquered. He treated the population of Europe like a giant laboratory. To Napoleon, a citizen was a biological constant. He demanded a census that didn't just count heads, but measured resources in millimeters. This was the birth of the bureaucratic state. By forcing everyone to use the same numbers, he erased the mathematical borders of the old world. The census became a tool of universalism. For the first time, a man in Italy and a man in Poland were being counted using the exact same logic. Napoleon didn't just conquer lands, he conquered the way people were measured. Chapter 14. The Aztec Tributary. Counting the Floating Gardens. Section 1. The Matricula de Tributos. In the Valley of Mexico, the Aztec Empire, the Mexica, managed a complex tribute census that was as beautiful as it was demanding. This was recorded in the Matricula de Tributos. The Aztecs didn't just count people, they counted obligation. Every province was required to send specific items to the capital, Tenochtitlan, twice a year. The census was a visual ledger of the world's riches. Imagine a clerk looking at a bark paper scroll and seeing a drawing of a warrior's suit. Next to it is a flag, the symbol for 20. This meant the province owed 20 suits of feathered armor. The census was a color-coded economy. But the most sophisticated count happened in the Chinampas, the floating gardens. Because the city was built on a lake, land was at a premium. The Aztec officials conducted a hydrographic census, measuring the exact dimensions of every mud-and-reed island to calculate how much maize it could produce. They were the masters of urban density. They knew exactly how many people the lake could feed. The census was a balance of the waters. If the numbers shifted, the empire shifted. To the Aztecs, counting was the art of keeping the sun in the sky through the steady flow of tribute. Chapter 15. The Census of the Wild, Counting the Uncountable. Section 1. The Biodiversity Audit. We have spent 15 chapters counting humans, but what about the 8.7 million other species that share this planet? Today, we are performing a global biodiversity census. This is the most difficult count of all because the subjects do not want to be found. How do you count the number of snow leopards in the Himalayas? You don't use a clipboard. You use environmental DNA, EDNA. Biologists can now take a single liter of water from a river and, by sequencing the DNA fragments floating in it, count every species of fish, amphibian, and mammal that has touched that water in the last 24 hours. This is the census of the invisible. We are counting traces. We use AI to analyze millions of hours of audio recordings from the Amazon to count bird species by their songs. We use satellites to count penguin colonies in Antarctica by the color of their guano on the ice. The census has become a healing tool. By counting what is left, we try to understand what we have lost. We are no longer counting to tax or to draft. We are counting to save. The number is a lifeline thrown out to the vanishing wild. Chapter 16. The Invisible City, Counting the Shadows. Section 1. The Mathematics of the Margin. Throughout this history, we have spoken of the census as a tool of power. But there is a population that the census traditionally fails, the stateless. In the sociology of the count, these are the hard-to-count HTC populations. If the census relies on a mailing address, what happens to the man sleeping on a park bench? If the census relies on legal status, what happens to the family hiding in the shadows of an informal settlement? For most of history, these people were statistical ghosts. They consumed resources, they occupied space, but on the official ledgers of the state, they were a null value. Today, the point-in-time pit count has become a grueling annual ritual for social workers. They walk the streets at 2 a.m. in the dead of winter, counting heads in shelters, under bridges, and in abandoned cars. This is not a census for taxes. It is a census of survival. Every person missed in this count is a person who will not receive a bed, a meal, or a vaccine. In the invisible city, the number is not a burden, it is a life raft. Section 2. The Refugee Megacity, Counting the Displaced. Consider the Zatari camp in Jordan or Kutupalong in Bangladesh. These are not camps in the temporary sense. They are some of the largest cities in their respective regions. But they exist outside the national census of any country. To manage these instant cities, the UN Refugee Agency UNHCR uses biometric enrollment. They don't just count names. They scan irises and map fingerprints. This is the high-tech census of the displaced. In a world where paper documents are lost to fire or war, your body becomes your census record. This creates a profound ethical double-bind. To be counted and biometrically scanned is to receive aid and protection. But it also means your movements are tracked by an international database. For the refugee, the census is a contract of necessity. You trade your data privacy for your biological survival. The invisible city is being mapped with more precision than any suburb in London or New York, because in the camp, the margin of error is measured in human lives. Section 3. The ghost in the algorithm, the undercount. Even in the most advanced nations, there is a phenomenon known as the differential undercount. Pause. Statistics tell us that certain groups, immigrants, young children, and the impoverished, are consistently missed by the census. This isn't just a clerical error, it is a political erasure. If a neighborhood is undercounted by 10%, it receives 10% less funding for hospitals, 10% less representation in government, and 10% less of a voice in its own future. Demographers now use proxy data to find these missing millions. They look at school enrollment records, trash collection volumes, and even the amount of sewage processed by a treatment plant. If the biological output of a city suggests 5 million people, but the census only shows 4.5 million, the scientists have found the ghost population. We are learning to count people not by asking them who they are, but by measuring the impression they leave on the world. We are counting the silence. Chapter 17, The Census of the Future, the Post-Human Tally. Section 1, The Internet of Things, IoT. By the year 2030, the most important census on Earth will not be of humans at all. It will be the census of machines. We are currently building the Internet of Things. Every car, every shipping container, every streetlight, and every smart fridge is being assigned a digital identity. We are counting the population of objects. This census happens in nanoseconds. Billions of pings per second tell the global network where every item is, how it is performing, and when it will die. This is the automated infrastructure. The census has moved from a 5-year cycle to a permanent pulse. We have created a world that is self-counting. In this future, the human census is just one small subset of a much larger global inventory. We are living inside a giant, self-aware spreadsheet. Chapter 18, The Final Summation. The Philosophy of the Number. Section 1, The Human-Shaped Hole. After 10,000 years of counting, we must ask ourselves, what is a census, really? Is it just a list? Is it just a tool for tax and war? No. The census is humanity's longest-running protest against oblivion. Every time a government or a church or a machine records a name or a number, it is making a claim that an individual existence matters enough to be remembered by the collective. But there is a Heisenberg uncertainty to the count. As soon as you turn a person into a number, you lose something essential about their humanity. You can count a man's age, his income, and his location, but you cannot count his grief. You cannot count his laughter. You cannot count the way he feels when he looks at the stars. The census creates a human-shaped hole. It gives us the outline of a person, but it never gives us the person themselves. We are the uncountable remainder that exists in the margins of every ledger ever written. Section 2, The Moral Weight of the Digit. We have seen that the number is never neutral. In the hands of a healer, the census is a map to a cure. In the hands of a tyrant, the census is a map to a grave. The philosophy of the number teaches us that observation is an act of power. To be counted is to be seen by the state. In a democracy, being seen is the first step toward having rights. But in a panopticon, being seen is the first step toward being controlled. As we move into a future where our counts are generated by algorithms and captured by ambient sensors, we must guard the sanctity of the zero. We must protect the right to be uncounted, the right to a private life that is not an entry in a database. The ultimate test of a civilization is not how well it counts its people, but how well it treats the people it cannot count. Section 3, The Eternal Pulse. The count began with a heartbeat, and it ends with a heartbeat. From the moment you were born, you became a part of this 10,000-year-old tally. You are a digit in the great ledger of the 21st century. You are a participant in the most complex, beautiful, and terrifying experiment in the history of our species, the attempt to know ourselves through the language of mathematics. The Sumerian scribe is gone. The Roman censor is dust. The Incan strings have rotted away, but the act of counting remains. It is the heartbeat of civilization. It is the pulse of the city. It is the silent rhythm of the world turning in the dark. Close your eyes and listen to the silence. In that silence, you are not a number. You are not a data point. You are the one who is counting. You are the observer. You are the soul. Chapter 19, The Leviathan's Ledger, the Great Maritime Census. Section 1. The Sovereignty of the Deep. For most of human history, the oceans were a statistical void. They were the blank spaces on the map marked here be monsters. But as the Great Age of Sail turned into the Age of Empire, the ocean became something else, a territory to be numbered. The maritime census was not about people, it was about depth and flow. Every ship was a floating census bureau. Navigators recorded soundings, the depth of the water, and the speed of currents. Why? Because the ocean is a desert of information. If you didn't count the fathoms, you hit a reef. If you didn't count the days since your last sighting of land, you starved. The logbook was the census of the void. It turned the chaotic, shifting waves into a grid of predictable numbers. By counting the ocean, we finally own the planet. Section 2. The Harvest of the Abyss. In the 20th century, the maritime census shifted from the surface to the life beneath. We began the census of marine life. This was the first time humanity tried to count the wealth of the commons. Scientists from 80 nations spent a decade trying to answer a simple question. How many fish are in the sea? They used sonar to count schools of herring that were miles wide. They used deep-sea submersibles to count life at the hydrothermal vents where the sun never reaches. This census revealed a terrifying truth. We were subtracting faster than nature could add. The maritime census transformed from a tool of navigation into a report card for the planet. It showed us the emptying ocean. By counting the whales, the cod, and the plankton, the census became an alarm bell. We realized that the infinite sea was actually a finite ledger, and we were deep in the red. Chapter 20. The Invisible Army, the Census of the Pathogen. Section 1. The Logic of the Outbreak. There is a census that happens in the shadows of every society, one that we only notice when things go wrong. This is the epidemiological count. When a new virus emerges, the first task of the scientist is to take a census of the sick. They look for patient 0. They calculate the R0, $R_0, the number of people a single infected person will pass the disease to. This is biological arithmetic. In these moments, the census is a race against time. The numbers aren't just data points, they are a forecast of a coming storm. During the Great Plagues of the past, this census was kept in the bills of mortality we discussed earlier. Today, it is kept in real time by the World Health Organization. We count the coughs, the fevers, and the genetic mutations. We are counting the enemy's strength. In the census of the pathogen, a high count is a declaration of war. Section 2. The Genetic Barcode. We are now entering the era of the metagenomic census. Scientists can now take a sample of air from a crowded subway station or a sample of sludge from a city sewer and perform a census of the microbiome. They can identify every bacteria, virus, and fungus present in that environment. This is the Sentinel census. It allows us to see an outbreak before the first person even feels a headache. We are counting the invisible army as it gathers its forces. By turning the microscopic world into a searchable database, we have moved the census from the village square to the molecular level. We are no longer just counting the people. We are counting the things that live inside us, on us, and around us. The census is the shield of science protecting the gates of the city. Chapter 21. The Census of the Mind. Quantifying the Ineffable. Section 1. The Gallup Revolution, the Birth of the Opinion. For thousands of years, the census asked, "Who are you? And what do you own?" But in the early 20th century, a new question emerged that changed the nature of power forever. What do you think? Before the 1930s, the public mind was a mystery. Politicians guessed what people wanted based on the size of a riot or the volume of applause. But a man named George Gallup believed that the mind could be sampled just like a population. He realized you didn't need to ask everyone, you just needed a representative sample. This was the birth of the poll. It was a census of the spirit. Suddenly, public opinion became a solid, measurable thing, a percentage that could rise or fall like the tide. We began to count approval ratings and consumer confidence. We turned the internal, private thoughts of the citizen into a commodity. The census was no longer just a record of your existence. It became a record of your desires. Section 2. The algorithm of mood sentiment analysis. In the 21st century, we no longer wait for a pollster to call us. We volunteer our mind census every second of every day. This is the era of sentiment analysis. Every time you post a like, every time you use an emoji, and every time you search for a specific phrase, an algorithm is performing a real-time census of your mood. Companies and governments use natural language processing to skim billions of tweets and posts to calculate the gross national happiness or the volatility of the street. Consider the passive count. You are being counted for your anger, your fear, and your joy without ever seeing a form. We have turned the human psyche into a data stream. The census has moved from the clipboard to the dopamine loop. We are no longer just units of labor, we are units of attention. The census is now a mirror that doesn't show our faces, but our shadows, the invisible patterns of what we love and what we hate. Chapter 22, The Census of Time, Counting the Seconds of a Life. Section 1, The Time Use Survey. There is one final resource that the state has begun to count, your time. In the late 20th century, nations began conducting time use surveys. They asked citizens to keep time diaries, recording every activity in 15-minute increments. They wanted to know, how much time do we spend unpaid? How much time is spent nurturing? How much time is leisure? This is the census of the experience. By counting our hours, the state tries to value the things that money cannot buy. They realize that a nation's wealth isn't just in its gold or its factories, but in the temporal capital of its people. When we count how a mother spends her afternoon or how a retiree spends his morning, we are performing a sociological autopsy of the day. We are trying to find out where our lives actually go. Section 2. The Lifetime Tally, the Great Accumulation. As we wrap up this journey, think about your own life census. If you were to count every breath you've taken, every step you've walked, and every person you've ever looked at, you would have a census of a soul. We are living in an age where our devices do this for us. Your phone counts your steps. Your browser counts your clicks. Your watch counts your heartbeats. We have become self-enumerating beings. We are obsessed with the quantified self. We believe that by counting our lives, we can optimize them. That if we just have enough data, we can live longer, work harder, and be happier. But remember the lesson of the Sumerians. The count is only a shadow. The sand in the hourglass doesn't care if it's counted. It only cares that it's falling. We are more than the sum of our numbers. We are the ones who breathe life into the ledger. Chapter 23. The Digital Graveyard, the Census of the Cloud. Section 1. The Weight of the Ghost. We have reached the final frontier of the count. For most of history, when a person died, they were subtracted from the census. They became a statistic of the past. But in the 21st century, the math has changed. We are the first generation to leave behind a digital ghost. Every profile, every photo, every stray thought we uploaded remains on a server somewhere. Statisticians estimate that by the year 2070, there will be more dead people on social media than living ones. We are building a digital graveyard that never stops growing. The census of the future will not just count the living, it will have to manage the population of the cloud. This is the eternal record. In the past, only kings had their lives recorded in stone. Now, every one of us has a monument of data. We are the first infinite generation. The census taker of the future will be an AI curating the memories of billions of souls who are no longer here to speak for themselves. We have finally achieved what the Sumerians dreamed of, a way to be counted forever. Section 2. The Final Tally, the Sum of Us. We have come to the end of our numbers. From the first notch on a bone to the last bit of data in a server, the census has been our way of saying, I was here. It is the human spirit's refusal to be forgotten. We count because we care. We count because we love. We count because we want to know that we belong to something larger than ourselves. As you drift off to sleep, let the numbers fade. Let the ledgers close. Let the satellites dim. You are no longer a data point. You are not a percentage. You are a unique, unrepeatable spark in a vast and beautiful universe. The census is finished. The world is quiet. The count is complete. You are home. Good night.